first lie Arun ever held was no bigger than his palm. Thin paper, thin ink. The kind of secret that folds into a cuff and warms to the skin, as if it had a pulse. Around him, the exam hall breathed like a tired animal. Fans clicking, chalk hissing, a teacher's sleeve dusted white as snow that never falls here. Outside, a goat worried a rope, and the tea seller rattled metal cups like a man at prayer. In Madhopur, they didn't call it cheating. They called it help. They called it tradition, the way you call a limp a style of walking, when there's no money for a doctor. Boys learned early that the world was a set of barred windows. Someone passing you an answer felt like passing you a key. But keys can open cages and also lock them. And a locked life often looks like a passed exam, until the day you need to run. Arun turned the paper in his cuff and heard his father's voice. The one that came in the dark when the town slept and the fans spun its slow circle. Don't become clever at small things and a coward at big ones. The room smelled of sweat and chalk and boiled starch. A teacher began to write answers on the blackboard, long rows of borrowed truth. For a moment, every boy believed in a future that could be copied neatly from the board, line by line, without smudging your soul. Then the siren cut the morning in half, and the new inspector walked in as if he were carrying weather on his shoulders. Inspector Ajay Singh had a face that looked used to choosing. He stood in the doorway without a flourish and watched the teacher's chalk skid to a stop. One of the boys with slicked hair tried to slide his cheat sheet under the desk. The paper stuck to his palm. "Continue," the teacher said, weakly, as if a continuation were possible. "Right, just right." The inspector crossed the threshold, boots dusted red from the road, and the principal met him with a smile that came too fast. There is a speed at which a smile becomes a plea. The principal had mastered it. "This is an old story," the principal said in a low voice. "We can talk in my office." They went to a room lined with files that smelled of old rain. A photograph of a freedom fighter hung crooked above a cabinet. The principal poured water with careful hands and explained that cheating was a custom, like festivals, like knocking a lemon with your toe to test its luck. "Without help," he said, "the slow ones will never pass. Then they will never get jobs. They will pull rickshaws, they will sell cigarettes, they will inherit nothing and have nothing to leave." This way, his hand hovered in a small flourish. "We help them stand up. And you?" the inspector asked softly. "Do you stand up?" The principal's eyes flicked to a framed certificate on the wall. He mentioned the market chairman and the bus depot's generosity. He mentioned donations that came like monsoon gutters overflowing. He mentioned nothing but meant everything. Then he placed an envelope on the desk, the way people place a garland before a god. The envelope made the sound of a sparrow hitting glass. Inspector Singh did not look at the envelope at first. He stood as if listening to a train that had not yet arrived. Then he opened it, counted the notes aloud, and called a constable into the room. "Bring the teacher from all A," he said. When the man arrived, chalk still white on his sleeve, the inspector placed the envelope in his hand and said, "Hold this." Then he looked at the principal. "Stand beside him." They stood shoulder to shoulder, like brothers at a bad wedding. "You say you help the boys," the inspector said. "I say you teach them to be small." He turned to the constable. "Arrest them both." The principal's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The teacher began to speak. Something about tradition, something about mercy. But the words dissolved in the warm air. The constable clicked cuffs, the way you click, a light before dawn, when everyone else is asleep. By the time the inspector stepped back into the hallway, the boys had torn their cheat sheets into confetti, and the room had gone blank with surprise. For a second, the future looked exactly like the walls. Scraped, empty, waiting. Arun stared at the inspector the way you stare at a man who has done something you will spend years trying to explain. The inspector caught his stare and held it without contempt. "Right," he said to the boys. And it was both instruction and blessing, Arun wrote. His hand trembled at first, then steadied. Whatever he knew, he knew. Whatever he didn't, he left in the white. Outside, a crow called as if to prove that mornings arrive even when no one invites them. When the results came, the town shook its head the way the old shake-off flies. Of 200, 175 failed. Markets talked, and tea stalls shook their metal cups like bells. The principal was made to spend the night in lockup. His wife brought in lentils and a story to explain it to the neighbors. Boys who had never learned to spell their names properly learned the shape of disappointment instead. The bus depot manager declared rickshaw pullers a menace. Papers called the inspector arrogant. Some called him brave. It depends on who you ask and how much they owe. Arun failed too, by a mark that felt like a paper cut. It was nothing, and it stung all day. He came home and found his mother at the stove. Her bangles pushed up past her wrists, a line between her brows deep enough to keep a seed. She didn't ask how he had done. She looked at his face and knew. "We will try again," she said. "Next time better." His father nodded, hands black with engine grease. He was a man who could fix engines and nothing else. He tightened bolts as if each were a prayer. "Better is a slow animal," he said. "We will walk with it." But Better did not walk with them that year. The school, shamed and stubborn, declared it would no longer permit rickshaws to wait at the gates. The bus depot paid the school more than the rickshaw boys could dream of counting. Arun's elder brother, Manoj, who had once watched the horizon like a man expecting a letter, began pulling a rickshaw in the afternoon, then at night when the city softened. Their little sister, Preeti, left school to help their mother roll chapatis for men who never learned her name. Poverty doesn't announce itself, it just sits down at your table and takes the first bite. One dusk, when the road was the color of rusted coins, a bus pulled too close to Manoj's rickshaw and scraped the paint off its side like a rough hand. A tout from the bus depot, the market chairman's nephew, laughed and tried to keep a family from climbing into Manoj's seat. "The bus is faster," he told them. "The rickshaw is for fools." Manoj did not speak. He took off his old rubber sandal and slapped the tout once across the cheek. It was a sound that said enough. In Madhopur, nobody slapped the bus depot's people. Not with a hand, not with a sandal. That night, 2 constables stopped the brothers at the outskirts of their lane, where buffaloes stood like dark statues and the air smelled of damp hay. The constables pushed them into a jeep and took them to the station, which was the color of a dead mango. Inside, under a faded calendar of mountain peaks, they were told their offense: obstructing transport and inciting a crowd. The charges climbed like vines up an empty wall. When Arun protested, one of the constables laughed. "You have become clever," he said. "Careful. Cleverness is a kind of theft." The station officer, non-Inspector Singh, asked them whether they preferred to apologize to the depot boss or spend a few nights on the floor under the fan. He used the word prefer, as if 2 beatings were laid out before them, one called A and one called B. When Arun spoke of the law, the officer smiled and hit Manoj across the ears with baton. When Arun spoke of his father's honesty, the officer made fun of the word honesty until it sounded like a child's name. That was when Arun made the mistake of his young life and said he would borrow his grandfather's rifle and return with a story that made more sense. He did not mean it even then, but words can run faster than their owners. "Then run," the officer said. Arun ran, not from the station, but from the foolishness in his mouth. Night peeled off the city in layers. He tried to see the path that did not lead to the same place. Every path did, or so it seemed. A job pulling a rickshaw, until your back curved like a question mark. 100 tiny humiliations sewn into your day like stitches. The emptiness afterward, when the pain goes to sleep. He stopped outside a low bungalow behind the tamarind tree, where a light burned in an upstairs window. He had seen the inspector going earlier, and decided the shorter way to manhood was to say the thing to the person who could change it. The guard at the gate told him to leave. Arun stood his ground until the guard pushed him away with a palm to the chest. The commotion woke the inspector, who came downstairs in a white vest and trousers, hair mussed like a man who has fought many battles with clocks. "Tomorrow," Inspector Singh said. "Come tomorrow." "Then why didn't you say tomorrow the morning you entered my exam hall?" Arun cried, anger bending his voice. "If not for you, I would have passed. I would have become someone else. Now my brother is in a cell. You will sleep. We will count ceiling cracks." The inspector's mouth tightened. "Come tomorrow," he said again. But this time, he put on his sandals and followed Arun to the station, in the same small night. At the desk, 2 constables were laughing with the tout from the depot, who had a handprint on his cheek and a grievance in his pocket. The inspector listened to their version until it bored him. He asked for the file. He read the charge and set the paper down. "Release the elder one," he said. Charged the tout for illegal intimidation. When no one moved, he took a baton from its stand and knocked it against the desk. The sound carried into corners and made the dust shake. Later, the inspector walked Arun and Manoj home. They passed by the chai stall where a radio hissed with old songs. They walked under a stretch of sky cut into squares by wires. They did not speak for a while. When they did, their words were simple and tired. "I thought you were like the rest," Arun said. "You will think many things before you know too," the inspector replied. "Listen, if you want your life to be worth your hunger, stop copying it from someone else's answer. Don't cheat, not once, not here." He tapped his temple. "It is harder and lonelier. It is worth more." Manoj nodded, one hand to his sore ear. Arun felt something settle inside him, a stone placed where a draft used to run. Days will work on a person the way water works on a stone. The year after, when the exam season came again, the school went back to old habits. The principal had been transferred, the inspector reprimanded by men whose chairs were higher. The chalk wrote answers on the board once more. The boys cheered the way you cheer for rain on a parched field. Only Arun kept his desk clear. He earned his mark fair and barely passed, but the word passed never looked better. A woman with wrists like saplings, his grandmother, took a metal tin from beneath her bed and found inside it the retirement money she had refused to spend. She pressed it into Arun's hand, the way mothers press medicine in children's flats. "For trains," she said, "for rooms with light, for examinations that make people stubborn." He tried to give it back. She folded his fingers over the notes and told him to be useful. He took a bus to Patna first, then a train to Delhi. On the bus, he fell asleep and woke to find the bag with his grandmother's money gone. He emptied his pockets and discovered emptiness has weight. In Delhi, he walked to a government building where an office was closed behind a chain, and a white paper said the state had gone broke and exams would be deferred. It felt like a joke the gods had invented in poor taste. Money gone, and the river dry. He sat outside a church and asked for food without saying the word beg. A manager in a canteen told him to wash dishes and then handed him a plate of rice, big as a defeated idea. When he finished it, a boy his age at the next table, clean shirt, new bag, voice like the city, raised an eyebrow, and asked if he was all right. He said his name was Karthik Pandey, though everyone called him KD. "My father's a contractor," KD said, grinning, as if he had introduced a superpower. "He builds things that fall down and then builds them again. Would you believe it? He wants me to be in the income tax department. 10 times the bribes, none of the dust." He lifted his cup. "To dust, though. The only honest thing." Arun told him about the cancelled exam, and was surprised to see KD's face sharpen. "So don't waste your morning on the state," KD said. "Try for the big one. UPSC. All India. The exam that eats people but spits out officers with initials. IAS, IPS. Those letters that move doors." Arun laughed with no humor. "Move them to where? I have no roof, no money." KD's grin turned mischievous. "You have me," he said. "Today you have me." KD paid for the tea, and then for a night in a hostel that smelled of damp walls and ambition. The next morning, he took Arun to a crowded lane near Old Rajinder Nagar, where coaching centers drew banners over the street like wet laundry. On the walls were the faces of boys and girls who had become initials. KD spoke of 3 stages, prelims, mains, interview, as if naming 3 mountains. The slopes glittered with notes on economy and polity and history and law. Arun signed up at the cheapest library and still could not pay. The librarian looked at his hands and hired him to sweep the floor before dawn. "You can read when the dust settles," he said. He read. He rose at 4 and read until the light sharpened. At noon, he swept powder off tables and stacked journals like bricks. In the evening, he carried crates of used books to a roadside stall. He sent money home when he could. In a week of such days, a decade can pass inside a man. He met Gaurav Sharma by chance and by luck. Gaurav was 30, maybe more, one of those men whose age hovers around their eyes. He had failed prelims 5 times, and made it to the interview once, which is a story with 2 endings. He talked free on the pavement across from the canteen. He quoted the Constitution like a prayer. He was the first to speak to Arun, as if effort were a country, and they were both citizens. "You'll need a table," Gaurav said, looking at the bruise under Arun's eye. "A color you get from lack of sleep, and a lamp that doesn't flicker. Come, you will stay in my room, pay when you wear a badge." It was the kind of kindness that makes you suspicious of your life's accounting. Arun moved into a narrow room with a tin trunk under the bed, and half a table, the other half being a stack of newspapers tied with rope. Gaurav drilled him through test after test, and mocked his first attempts at essays, then read them again and nodded gently, as if encouraging a seed. Katie came around in the evenings to drink soda, and complain loudly about simplicity. He had a way with words that made seriousness look old-fashioned. He admitted he had no love for the exam, only for the dream of being a journalist who could say things men said hush about. "My father thinks a camera is a toy," he said. "He called me his expensive mistake, so I will let him pay." One morning, the results for Gaurav's latest interview came. His name was not on the list. He stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it and put it away like a letter from a city he would not visit. "That is that," he said. "The wheel moves on." He took Arun to a chai stall and bought a samosa with coins, and the two of them ate in silence, shoulders touching like brothers at a bus stop. That year, Arun failed the prelims by the small mark that is the difference between a bruise and a scar. Katie laughed too loudly. "See," he said, "it is a stomach that eats and eats. We are snacks." Gaurav placed a hand on Arun's head and said, "Now you know where your bones are soft. Begin again." Arun began again. He washed floors, sorted books, wrote short notes in a hand that had learned patience. He kept an old clock by his elbow, a knocker to remind him that time hits first. When he closed his eyes, he saw not a mountain, but a series of steps worn by other feet. Riya Shah entered his life like a draft through a door you didn't know was open. He met her in the library, where he was wiping a table and she was reading a book on aeronautics. She had a voice that made you think of water over stones. Her father worked in a small government office in Gujarat. She was in Delhi to try for the state engineering exam the next year. "You're an engineer?" she asked, seeing the book in his hand, and old text on aircraft systems someone had left behind. He could have corrected her. He did not. He nodded, and a small lie stepped into the room and sat where truth used to sit. They met under a peepal tree after classes. She sang sometimes, old songs. Her mother used to hum in the kitchen. He told her about rivers that abandon their beds and maps that lie, and men who believe them. She laughed easily, and asked questions that lifted your head when your eyes wanted to drop. The lie in the corner grew fat and friendly. When the wind shifted and her hair blew across her face, Arun felt both braver and smaller. It was Gaurav who found the lie's sore spot. One day in class, the teacher asked a question about rocket staging, and Riya looked at Arun like a girl who knows a secret and waits for a performance. Arun stood up. The tongue that had learned essays decided that numbers were heavy. He stumbled, and the silence fell the way a book falls when you knock the table. Later in the lane, he told Riya the truth. He expected anger. What he got instead was a quiet more painful. "A beautiful lie is still a lie," she said. "We will think about truth. We will also think about time." He went back to the small room above the printer's shop and felt the broken pieces of his life in his pockets like gravel. The librarian accused him of taking a commission from the sale of waste paper and called his father a man who loved righteousness because he could not afford anything else. Arun quit the library that day. He rented a corner in a flour mill where the machines turned like sleepless animals and studied between sacks of grain. Katie visited and laughed at him. "You are like men who carry bricks to build a house for someone else," Katie said. "This is not noble. This is stupid." Gaurav turned on Katie with an anger Arun had not seen before. He spoke of the willingness of the poor to labor in ugliness, and their right to be proud of it. He spoke softly and made Katie look older than his age. Later, Katie apologized in a half-joking voice, and brought Arun a clock that ticked like a small heart. 16 hours, Katie said, pushing it across the table. "If you must be mad, be thorough." That year, Arun cleared prelims. He did not celebrate. He had learned what the mountain did to men who danced too early. He rented time on a chair at a coaching center to practice essays. He wrote 12 out of 20 in the exam, and knew as his hand cramped that the rain would be late again. He failed the mains. He visited Riya to apologize, to confess the other truth. That part of his failure had been borrowed from her absence. The guard at her house told him to leave. Her father had received a phone call, whispered, from a man who said Riya was in love with a liar from Delhi, who swept floors. The man said other things. The father believed enough of him. Arun suspected KD, called him in anger, then answered a frantic call the next day from a police station. KD had been arrested for shouting drunken promises at the moon and frightening a street of shopkeepers. Arun went to the station and stood before a desk, where a constable balanced a pen behind his ear like a nail. He spoke of procedure and rights. The constable smiled. Arun kept speaking, wrong voice, but right words, until the station officer realized he was the kind of poor man who had learned to read the law, which is a dangerous creature. KD was released with a scolding. He hugged Arun and then stepped back, shame touching his good clothes. "Forgive me," KD said. "I about Ria's father." "I?" He did not finish the sentence. Some debts cannot be discussed, only carried awkwardly until the straps cut shoulders, and you put them down because your hands won't work anymore. They parted, less like friends, and more like men who had once sheltered together in a sudden rain. The next day, Ria sent a letter with a cousin who carried her courage in a pouch. She was leaving her father's house to sit her exam in Rajkot, and then, if she passed, to return to Delhi for interviews only if she could stand beside a man who stood on his own. "Whether you wear a khaki uniform or a miller's shirt," she wrote, "I will know you by your eyes." It was the kind of letter that keeps a man awake and honest. Arun returned to his desk. He opened a file of cuttings. He had begun collecting stories of villages that ran out of water, schools that had no girls beyond grade 5, police stations where officers stood alone in a room of bribe-takers like candles in a wind. He searched for patterns the way a patient puts together symptoms to guess at a diagnosis. That was when fortune, which does not like to be chased, came to sit in the chair opposite him. A name from old interviews, Divakar Mohan, had become a minor officer in the Home Ministry. Years ago he had bought tea from Arun at the library kiosk, believing him a worker, and had promised to help if help ever meant more than a word. Arun, desperate, found his email address at the bottom of a file, and wrote, "I do not want a favor. I want a correction." Mohan invited him to a small government flat, where tiffin carriers lined the counter. He tested Arun the way you test a rope before a climb. "Write 200 words in 8 minutes," he said, setting a timer, "on why you cannot tolerate copying when the state itself is a copy of whoever wins." Arun's mind took the first wrong road and then doubled back. The timer beeped before he found a clean sentence. He had managed 90 words, of which half apologized. "The mains is a sprint in a storm," Mohan said. "You will replace your bad habits with better ones. Less throat clearing, more backbone. Write daily, reason fast. The time to think slowly is before the question." Arun followed the instructions, the way the faithful follow an old path. He wrote 200 words in 8 minutes, on subjects he had not chosen: caste and climate, and corruption and covenant. Gaurav stood at his shoulder with a pencil, and crossed out where the words grew fat with self-pity. "Skin them," he said, smiling. "Make them lean." Arun moved into Gaurav's room again, which meant he moved into someone's kindness again. Ria sent him a plastic watch with a note. 16 hours only, if you must sleep 8 in between. And he said it with care and obeyed. He did not speak much to KD, who had moved back with his father in a big house where money piled like damp clothes. Without coincidences, life looks less like a novel, and more like a road. He liked that now. He took the mains once more. He wrote 18 out of 20. He came out trembling from the hall like a man who has run out of breath, and found he still had a step to go. On a public phone, he called home. His mother's voice broke into new pieces and then reassembled into laughter. Then came the interview. Last gate. Last pair of eyes. Ria returned quietly, and pressed a letter into his palm in the corridor of the commission, the kind of long corridor made of fluorescent light and other people's breath. "Open it after," she said. "Win or lose." The room was cold, and smelled of old polishing wax. 5 people sat behind a table. One of them, a man with neat hair, looked at Arun's file, and frowned. "I see you took a year off between school and college," he said. "Why?" "I failed," Arun answered. "It took me time." He could feel the man's impatience like a low hum. Another asked why the school in Madhupur had been raided 10 years ago, the morning of the exam. "It had always been raided," Arun said. "Just not by the law." "Do not be clever," the man with neat hair said. "We do not like clever." "I am trying not to be," Arun said. "I am trying to be honest." A woman at the end of the panel studied him with curiosity rather than suspicion. "Why not a small lie?" she asked. "Say your grandmother died that year. Say your house burned. Everyone tells an acceptable lie. The result is the same. Why must you display your weakness?" "Because the lie would have saved me then and cost someone else later," Arun said. "Also because I am tired. It is easier to remember one story." Another man asked about policy and numbers. Another asked about procedure. He answered what he knew, then stopped when he did not. The neat-haired man leaned forward. "If your last attempt fails, what then?" "I will be a teacher," Arun said. "I will stand outside my town school if they do not let me in, and teach whoever comes to stand with me. I am not a sun, but I can be a lamppost." "Poetry," the neat-haired man said, disgusted. "No," the woman said. "A choice." They sent him out to wait in a hallway where the clock did not move. He opened Ria's letter and read 4 lines. "Whether you wear letters before your name or after, whether the city calls you sir, or forgets your face, I will walk with you. Will you walk with me?" It looked like a marriage proposal, because it was, and his hands shook over the paper like leaves when the rail wind runs. When the results were posted 2 weeks later, children swarmed the notice board, as if it were a sweet shop. Arun's name sat there like a shy guest at his own party. Bora found it first, then pressed his forehead to the board as if to cool it. Katie arrived with a camera and 2 friends and shouted as if he had always believed. His father called and said nothing for a 10-second silence, and then said, "I thought I'd built roads, perhaps I only blocked them. Congratulations." Arun traveled home. His mother lit a lamp before the gods, and then before his face. His father shook the inspector's hand in the lane. Yes, the inspector had come. He had gray at his temples and a fatigue around his mouth, that comes to men who refuse certain gifts. He stood beside the knee, eyes taking the measure of the boy he had once told to write. "You will be tempted," he said quietly, "once in a while, once in a week, once in a day. People will call it efficiency. Do not confuse a shortcut with a bridge." Arun gave him an envelope, the first wedding invitation he had printed. Ria's parents had chosen to sit in the front row. JD had been asked to bring his camera. He had taken a job at a small news bureau covering stories nobody else wanted. Gaurav stood as witness. In the photo, all their faces look equal under the same light. That is how photos lie. That is also how they tell the truth. Arun did not become a big officer with a car that parted traffic and left silence behind. He became a man with a desk and a gate to unlock in the morning. The kind of officer whose phone never slept. He went to schools where chalk squeaked and said nothing about cheating. He stayed at the back wall and watched boys whose wrists carried secrets. He waited outside exam halls for the first brave one to throw his answer paper into the bin and say, "Start again." He found police stations where the ledger had 2 sets of numbers, one for the world and one for the day after. He left a single book sometimes in a place a constable would find it. A copy of the code, cracked at the spine. He went to villages where a road had been paid for, but existed only in the minds of the men who signed the tender. He walked the field with a teacher and made a map with his feet. He wrote a letter in a language the contractor could not buy. He sat across from a bus depot official and listened to a long story about legacy and benefit and old arrangements, and then he folded the story and handed it back and said, "No." Some days he lost the argument and wrote the loss down, so it would not become normal. Some nights he drove home past a school under a single bulb, and remembered how a room can tilt toward light. He took Ria to the city where she worked in a lab that manufactured small things that make bigger things safe. They saved money in a metal box the way old people save rice. They sent Preeti back to school and found for her a room with a roof that did not leak. Manoj left the rickshaw and learned to fix phones by watching a man in the market for 6 days a week and failing for 6 months, then becoming the man others watch. Once, after the rains came late, Arun returned to Madhapur and stood at the edge of the lane where he had once stood shouting at a man in a white vest. The town had new posters and the same old corners. A boy ran past, clutching a small paper in his fist. Arun reached out and touched his shoulder. "What's in your hand?" he asked. The boy opened his fist. A folded answer sheet, thin as a sin. His eyes dared Arun to try a sermon. Arun did not deliver one. He nodded toward the school. "You know where the bin is," he said. The boy looked at him, then at the paper, then at the school. He turned and walked away. The way you walk away from a bargain that is too cheap even for you. Arun watched him and thought of the inspector at the school gate long ago, counted the ripples of a choice. Years slid by in the ordinary way, small meals, small arguments, small victories. They had a son, and later a daughter, who learned to say lamppost before they learned sun, and thought it was a kind of tree. They learned their father's habit of checking windows before sleeping, and their mother's habit of bringing back small sweets for the neighbor's children, when there was an extra coin. Sometimes when the city coughed dust and the power went out, and the only sound was the snore of a neighbor, Arun thought of all the men and women he knew who had failed. He remembered Gaurav's file folded like a letter he did not send. He remembered the boy in the exam hall, who had wanted the top rank, and finished with nothing but a memory that embarrassed him. He remembered his own paper, blank in places, honest in others. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a man who had chosen once to be more tired and more alone, and had discovered that the kind of loneliness you choose feels different from the kind given to you by arrogance or fate. On the 5th anniversary of the day, his name appeared on the list. He went to see Inspector Singh, who had been posted to a district where the heat made men polite. The inspector's hair had gone whiter, his smile smaller. They sat on a veranda where a lizard clicked like a second hand. "Do you remember the boy with the rifle in his mouth?" the inspector asked, and laughed quietly. "I remember the man in a vest at midnight," Arun said. "Most people forget their beginnings," the inspector said. "Or they rewrite them to make themselves look brave. Keep yours, that is your lamp." They spoke of cases and losses, and the price of small refusals. They did not speak of awards because there had not been many, and that was right. They parted under a sky that had stretched the day longer than it should, and the inspector's sandal slapped a rhythm against the ground that sounded like a long memory. The morning of his grandmother's death anniversary, Arun took his children to the river and showed them how to float a lamp in a leaf boat. The river was low, exposing stones like old knees. The lamp drifted and went out in a dark patch where the current was stubborn. "It didn't work," his son said. "It went dark." "It is not about the lamp," Arun said. "It is about the hand that sets it down." They walked home along the embankment where grass had cut its own path. A train moaned across a bridge. The children counted carriages, and Arun counted, quietly, the small hinges on which a life turns. He knew now that the world wasn't won by thunder, not really. It turned instead on quieter hinges. A boy refusing a paper in his cuff. A girl walking back to a classroom after the town called her foolish. A mother saving a single note so her son could take a train. A tired officer choosing to be lonely and right instead of popular and wrong. The grand speeches never reached far, but a steady hand at a small door did. Arun had not become a hero. He had become the kind of man who lifted gates before dawn, who signed forms without selling his name, who listened and did not look away when the truth limped in. He believed now that integrity is not a medal you pin on a day you feel brave. It is a habit of light, practiced when no one applauds, like checking a fact, returning a borrowed book, telling a child why shortcuts cost more than they save. If there is a lesson worth carrying through crowded stations and dusty offices, it is this. The answer you copy will never fit the question your life asks of you. And if there is a hope sturdy enough to outlast elections and floods, it is this. Small, honest acts, repeated in unremarkable rooms, can move a country an inch toward morning. Not a banner, not a battle, an inch. A firefly is not the sun, people like to say, and they are right. But in certain nights, in certain alleys, a handful of fireflies is enough to show you the path home.